Welcome back, everyone, to the Transcending Neurodiversity podcast. Today's guest is Nick Tabor. I'm a huge fan of his content, and if you like my content, you'll love his content. There's a lot of commonality, a lot of overlap. Nick often speaks on the problems within the schooling system, psychiatry, and other harmful practices from powerful institutions regarding mental health and well-being. Just among other things, he covers a lot of different topics here. And yeah, I just kind of give the audience just a little background on you. Why are you making these videos? And yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. Really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm a big fan of yours as well. So this is a real pleasure for me. Um, so I kind of started talking about this really from a place of not really finding like anything else like it. It's kind of just like what I was looking for, right? I was looking for people to speak to all of these things that I experienced and finding like little bits of insight here and there, but not in a kind of comprehensive way. Um, and really, it came from my own experience of as a kid being really at odds with my environment, like kind of at odds with my family system. It was quite toxic and dysfunctional in a lot of ways, and also at odds with my school environment. But what happened was I was basically pathologized, right, for not getting along in it and for kind of being rebellious and acting out. I was, you know, diagnosed with psychiatric disorders and was like treated like I had a medical problem. And then as I became a teenager, I became kind of more rebellious and was like pushing against things more. And that's when I got sent to the troubled teen industry, which was kind of like a bit different from child psychiatry in some ways, though it's also part of it because it's more of like it's less about saying you have a brain disorder and it's more about just like kind of coercing you. But either way, it's like about trying to get kids to kind of adapt to their environment and like perform the right attitudes and the right behavior. And it's not really, and I think this is true of the school system in general and many family systems, it's not actually about developing real well-being, developing your real potential. Um, yeah, I think that these things are not conducive to the development of like the whole human being, you could say. And so I think like that's really what I was coming up against. And so I've just been inspired to, help other people that went through these kinds of things and help them to like get on a path of self-healing and self-development coming out of that.
Hmm. Totally. Yeah. And what are like some of these, I guess, harmful practices? I guess like, when you zoom out and you look at a bigger picture, what like you always felt something was off. What was off? Like tell me about some of these things that you disagree with.
Well, so I think that when we're kids, a lot of us we feel that something's off, right? Like you're saying, and I think a lot of the kids that get diagnosed with a lot of these different disorders, like something like I think it's like 11% maybe of kids are diagnosed with ADHD. It's like an enormous number. Millions of kids have been diagnosed, as well as other things like pediatric bipolar, all kinds of different things, right? Like you have your own story with that, and so I think for a lot of those kids, it's like we're feeling that something's off in our environment, but the environment is in denial, you could say. They don't believe that. But now, like, as I look back on it and I read more and I understand more, it's super clear what that actually was, right? And it was really like, it had to do with these two different environments that are dominant in most kids' lives, school and the family environment. And in the school environment, it was like, I think that kids are dealing with like a conventional school situation that is arguably quite authoritarian. Like I would say that the public school system and just our method of like contemporary education in general is quite authoritarian, right? And it's very much about compliance. It's very much about, subjecting yourself to surveillance and non-consensual evaluation and judgment. And it's about it like conditions you heavily from the outside in. And so you're not you become disconnected from your own like internal signals, your own inner compass, right? Your own like voice and who you really are. And and I think often it's a similar thing in family systems because there's similar paradigms around raising children in that way. Um, and often in family systems that goes along with like a lack of emotional depth, poor relational awareness, poor communication skills. And so the kids that like are feeling how incredibly, in my opinion, objectively wrong this is, then these like mental health services come in that basically force them to adjust to that. And so I think like when you look at the enormous market of mental health services for kids, that's a lot of what's really going on is like these schools and these parents want these kids to adjust. They want them to be complied. They want a certain degree of passivity. And so these different services like medication and therapy for kids, and I would argue social emotional learning, behavior modification, all these different things act to essentially do that. And so for me, as I've been able to like look more and more at how I was conditioned by all of that, how I was shaped by that, it becomes a lot clearer. And that's also a great opportunity to like start to release that stuff and really like, take our lives into our own hands and take full responsibility for where we're going.
Wow. So much resonance with like so many things you're saying. Yeah, it's almost like so many of us just have had such similar experiences, and so you really speak on that in a great way. And yeah, and so one thing I was wondering when you say that is like, why do you think it got so authoritarian? You know, both schooling system and like parenting practices. I mean, how has it gotten authoritarian, or just I mean, maybe it's always been authoritarian. Like, yeah, why do you think that is?
That's an interesting question. Like what, yeah, like what the road to that was. I mean, yeah, because like there's two questions there, right? There's like, how did we get there? And then there's like, what is, right? And I'm very clear that this is certainly what happened to me, and I think what happens in general. I'm less clear on like why that's the case. Like historically, sociologically. I mean, there's been some documentation that like in terms of the history of the school system, it was kind of created around the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to have like obedient, soldiers and factory workers and that kind of thing. But like yeah, I'm not too clear on that, and it's not like a huge part of like my own, you know, way of making sense of all of this. Um, but um, I think that like a lot of it just gets so embedded in people, and so this is especially with families, right? But also why we defend the school system is we get really shaped by it, and then we kind of believe that what happened to us was for our own good, and then we just perpetuate it. And I think like unless you disrupt that process, or to the degree that you don't disrupt that process, it just kind of continues. So,
Hmm.
and the thing I'll add is that my understanding is that like the level of basically like adult directed activity in kids' lives, particularly with regard to school, has just continued to get worse and worse and worse. And I think that this is continuing in a lot of ways, right? So like when my understanding is like, for example, when, like the like our say our grandparents' generation, when they were in school, they had a lot less time of adults controlling them. Basically, they were able to spend a lot more time outside, doing different things, right? Like, and they would, they had to like figure things out on their own, right? A lot more. And there was just over the decades more and more adult intervention in kids' lives. And in some ways it's scary because like I think that things have gotten a lot worse since I was a kid, right? When I hear about, for example, like the way now social emotional learning is universal in school, right? It's an, sounds like an incredibly invasive practice. And and things like the tech surveillance in schools. There's more of this like behavior management software. So we just see there seems to be this tendency to like just enter in with more control. Like, oh, there's this problem. We're not actually going to look at the systemic issue and deal with it there. Oh, we're just going to come in with this other intervention, which creates this industry for all these other people, and just going to keep doing that and doing that. And it just seems like yeah, it's just this because you're not dealing with like the structural issues. There's more things that you have to intervene with.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, totally. I get the sense that yeah, it's always been, quite controlling and I don't know, irrational. But then, yeah, it seems like in the last few years, it's almost reached this sort of boiling point where people are just like, yo, something is going on here. I think, yeah, the technology that you mentioned, I think people are starting to kind of wake up to that, like just how these new technologies, social medias, but also, yeah, surveillance technologies are actually just causing a lot of harm. I think psychiatry has sort of like reached this point where people are just like, these diagnoses are getting out of hand, these, this overprescription, everything. So I think we are seeing sort of like a turning point, a slow, like, yeah, like everyone's kind of like waking up to this reality. One thing that you mentioned was social emotional learning. And what's interesting is, yeah, I guess I don't really know much about it. I kind of always had this perception, like you hear it being mentioned in like politics and like legislation and stuff. And it seems like this sort of like progressive solution, sort of like, yeah, we're addressing the emotions, it's like a positive step. But hearing you speak on it, it seems like, yeah, you see something in it that's not right. So tell me more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's not actually progressive. I would say it's like regressive or pseudo progressive because the thing is with it is it's like it's so it sounds good, right? It's like, oh, we're talking to kids about their emotions and we're teaching them skills, but like relational skills, right? But there's a couple of problems there. One is these kids aren't consenting to that. So nobody's consenting to this, right? Communities aren't consenting to it, and certainly the kids are not consenting to it. So you're bringing like that kind of introspection and that kind of thing to an area where there's no consent. Like that's incredibly problematic. And that opens the path towards all kinds of like destructiveness and damage, which is exactly, I think, the same problem with the troubled teen industry and kids being forced into therapy and all of that, right? So what I think largely ends up happening is the school system, which has its own logic and its own authoritarian tendencies and its own goals, uses social emotional learning to achieve those goals, right?
Mm.
So they end up deciding like what emotions are correct, right? Which ones are need to be changed, and so they use it as basically a form of behavior modification to get kids to like to adapt to that school environment. And so I think that like when you look at it like that as basically like colonizing kids' minds, it's a lot more problematic than just, oh yeah, we're teaching kids emotional skills and relational skills. I think things like that have to be done in a like in a setting of tremendous consent, and the degree to which you can really do that with kids, I'm not really sure about that. I think that the best you can do for kids in that regard is for you yourself as the adult to show up in the best way possible. For you yourself to like be authentic and honest and have great emotional awareness and relational skills. Then they'll, hopefully see that and kind of pick up on that over time. But like taking this proprietary methodology and like imposing it on kids um, yeah, I don't think it's really like doing what it's actually claiming to.
Yeah. What are like some, I guess, examples of this? Like you mentioned, like like kids kind of being brought into talk therapy without really consenting to it. Maybe like some like lessons on like, these emotions are good, these emotions are bad. But yeah, and then overall, I get the sense it's kind of like invalidating. It's not actually for the kids' benefit. It's more just for like yeah, it's like behavioral control of some sort. So I guess
Yeah.
what are like some examples of like this happening and like how is it sort of leading to that?
Well, I mean, I think in a nutshell, it's basically like kids are experiencing whatever they're experiencing in their environment, right? And these environments have all kinds of problems, like so imagine like you're the head of a household. I think you don't have kids, right? I don't have kids either, but like if you're the head of a household, in order to have a really healthy family that's really conducive to the development of your kids, like that takes a lot of awareness. That's not easy, right? It takes constant effort to to have good communication and to know yourself better and like help support that in your spouse. And so I don't, and so that's just difficult, right? And so I don't think it's generally the norm for people to do that, or at least not the norm for people to do that well. And I certainly don't blame anybody there, but like it is what it is, right? And so if kids are in that and they're feeling pain because of whatever unresolved issues are going on in the family system, then I firmly believe that sending the kid to therapy makes no sense because like what's the therapist going to do, right? The therapist so like if it's an adult, well maybe the therapist can talk to the adult about what they're experiencing, can talk about having better boundaries, whatnot, can talk about like how they can increase their own agency. None of that applies to the kid because the kid is trapped in that environment, right?
Mhm.
They have to adapt. They have to adjust. The power differential between the parents and the kid is so great. The only way for the kid to survive is to adjust. So, what is the therapist going to do other than force that onto the child? Not to
Mhm.
mention the fact that the power imbalance in a therapy relationship is enormous even for adults and is very problematic even for adults. With kids, I mean, it's orders of magnitude worse. So for all those reasons, it's really problematic. And I think it's essentially the same thing with social emotional learning, right? It's like so kids are in this school system where they're exerting mechanical control over their minds and they're like shaping them in ways that are problematic. Are the people practicing social emotional learning aware of this? Like, do they agree with that assessment, or do they think that environment just is, and the kid has to adapt to it? So I think most of these cases we're starting from a place of not actually understanding the truth or anything like that. But they firmly believe, all these practitioners, these therapists, practitioners and whatnot, they firmly believe that they're helping and supporting, right? So I think that like they drink their own Kool-Aid. They really believe it.
Mhm.
And I think that's the problem. And that's why like as kids we're there and it's like this person is so incredibly inauthentic. They have this like fake warmth and like what do we and it's so incredibly confusing because they actually believe it, but what we understand like deep down is something very very different that we
Mhm.
can't trust.
Yeah. Yeah, what came to mind for me there was just like, yeah, no amount of social emotional learning is going to make this, authoritarian system better for anyone. Like no social emotional learning is going to make school make sense for people. It's always just going to be a backwards sort of practice in the way that it's done these days. And what also came to mind was just like, yeah, you're kind of right in the analogy of like kind of like comparing a teacher to almost like a head of household, like a parent. Like it requires a lot of self-development. Like you need to show up as a very mature person. And it's true that, with teachers, all they need to do is just go through schooling and like, get the conceptual aspect of teaching right in the way that it's taught. But yeah, there's very little about, like an inherent, so yeah, like building your own emotional resilience or like your own emotional nervous system flexibility.
Yeah.
And when I look back at like teachers that taught me in like elementary school and stuff, like those people were definitely not very self-developed and like were genuinely like passing on trauma to other kids in the way that they were like trying to discipline them, like, oh, go outside and like, just yeah, or like, go out of the classroom, or just like all these different like ways of disciplining kids, which is just yeah, pretty underdeveloped. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's only like it's like they only focus on the through it without bringing like compassion, empathy, and like a real human touch to like any of this. Um, so I don't know
Yeah.
how to like turn that into a question, but yeah, there's something on that topic where it's like the over conceptualization versus like the actual like human experience. Like, does anything come to mind when I say that?
Yeah, totally. I think like the more years you spend cultivating yourself in that way, the more of that you bring. And so there's that. And then also like if you look at these things as systems, that's a huge factor too, right? So like I think in a family system, the parents, they're the ones with the most power in that system. But if you look at a classroom, that's like a lot more complicated, because teachers, they don't really have the power that much, so like a teacher can meditate or what or do these things, right? And that could have an impact. I think that often does have an impact because kids are like, I like this teacher, I don't like this teacher. But at the end of the day, I think it's much more the logic of that system that's driving the kids' experience. You know what I mean? Because it's the system that's determining what the kids do. That's determining, how the teachers have to, what the teachers are required to force the kids to do, et cetera, et cetera. And like there's so much. This is part of why the school system's so authoritarian, is it's like it's so centralized, right? It's like it's like the school, like the principal is above the teacher. Well, it's like, the kids are below the teacher, the principal's above the teacher, the superintendent or whatever is above the principal, the state, federal level, potentially a global level, because they're talking about that having like global standards of education. This is really like there's pretty rigid, pretty like powerful authorities that are dictating, you know, like what kids need to be doing with their lives, and even like what the contents of their minds should be. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, what comes to mind too is honestly like the question of like what is good leadership? So like for example, because yeah, like obviously an adult, like the parents in a parent-child relationship, like the parent has their responsibilities, but like the child also like contributes a lot. And so it's kind of the parent's job to like lead with maturity and with just like direction and experience and wisdom. And then also like, but it doesn't mean that the parent has the power or like all the power. The kid also voices their needs. The kid also needs to be a kid. The kid like provides their own sort of value in that relationship as well. I mean, and so yeah, like I think that's what good leadership is good leaders bring others up. They do this, they want to support the kid, bring out the potential in the kid, and let them have a voice, and just it's like a negotiation almost. That's what a good family system is. It's like there's a lot of good communication, healthy communication.
yeah,
And so compare that to the schooling system, and there's like zero communication going on, really. It's just like, kids be put in this place, teacher takes the whole lead. If the kids misbehave, do this, and that to them, until they fit back in the box. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, the whole thing is, yeah, it's almost like it's missing that sort of like, yeah, that picture of what it truly means to be a leader.
yeah,
And I think a lot of it comes back down to like just economic incentives maybe, and just like needing kind of like the end goal being just like we need these kids to be employees, you know? Like a good parent wants the kid to be themselves and to be, you know, the best version of themselves. And in the schooling system, it's not like that. It's just like we want to you know, it's like the whole system just revolves around, you know, making them an employee.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, would you agree with that?
Um, yeah, I mean, in terms of like why, I would agree with it to a degree. Like in terms of why the school system is the way it is, and all of that, it's hard to say because I think it's like very overdetermined. There's a lot of different things going on there. Like why it looks that way. I think a lot of it is like we talked about. It's like people get shaped by these things and then they buy into it. So it's like it's in people on some level. But then there's also these broader incentives. There is like tremendous, it does serve like the kind of dominant economic interests in our society to a degree, but then it's also counterproductive for that in some other ways too. So it's like, why are we this way? Is it just because there's all of this like institutional momentum and all of this power behind it? But on this question of leadership, I actually made a video a month or so ago on leadership, and it's very much like touches on what you're saying because I think like a lot of the leadership, if you could even call it that we have today, particularly as kids experience it, is like it's based around like domination or like dominator culture, right? It's like not really about consent. It's about kind of, overriding whatever your inherent tendencies would be in order to like get you to kind of like behave in whatever way is expected or perform in whatever way is expected, and because of that you end up losing yourself, right? Like you lose that connection to your own internal impulses, and you don't get to cultivate that over time, right? Which is like what makes life fulfilling and wonderful, right? Is you cultivate that like inner compass or whatever you want to call it over time. So with that kind of leadership model, especially like when it comes to kids, you destroy that. And I think like a better kind of leadership is actually cultivated from that place, like from the inside out, right? Um, and then because then you're able to then respect that in other people, you're able to communicate better, and that creates its own kind of power, but it's more of like a good kind of power, that allows you to like influence people, but in a way that they ultimately would consent to and would like, right? So I think like that's a much better model of leadership.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, and you mentioned kind of like a really important subtopic here, which is just that like that losing connection with yourself, which is actually like a lot of like the premise of my channel is just like how do we connect back to ourselves? How do we like transcend these labels and all this BS like we've been through? So like losing connection to yourself. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like how school might have like led me to lose connection with myself. And pretty much like what I get is just that they indirectly told me that I need to choose like a math, science, technology, like a STEM field. I need to be good at those things. And being good at anything else, like including art, or just having like my own quirks or interests wasn't gonna get me anywhere. I needed to master these classes
Yeah.
and do well by them. And in order to do well by them, you have to pay attention for 50 minutes to an hour at a time. You need to be good at memorizing things. You need to just, yeah, jump through all these hoops. And yeah, I think eventually that does sort of lead to one losing connection with themselves. But I'm sure there's like a lot of other factors that play into that. So I guess when it comes to like losing connection to yourself, like what else do you think is going on?
Yeah, it's that dynamic you're talking about is really profound, where it's like the context gives us this like input about what's important and who we should be. And like when you're a kid, it's I think it's just kind of reality. You don't actually see, well, these are just people and they have their own problems and they have their own biases, and I am free to disregard that, right? Like when you become an adult. And so I got a lot of that too. Like, it's like don't just this message, like don't listen to yourself. Don't you don't even have an inner compass or a voice or whatever that is, right? Or like an authentic self. Like and it's very much like about, yeah, I think often we get these messages of kind of being practical, whatever that means, and you know, and so we end up just doing what's expected of us. Um, and when I think of like, I think about maybe I would think about things in like two different buckets of like what actually facilitates that kind of connection to ourselves and what hurts it, you know? I mean, in my own life, certainly what sort of acts to sever that connection to myself were things like the school system, right? With all of this kind of like coercion and this sense of like you have to do this, you have to do what we say, and that's what's good for you, and like all of this evaluation and all this judgment from these people who I really didn't respect, and um, it's that kind of like technocratic control of the school system. It's that a lot of the paradigms and input from the mental health system can disconnect our connection to ourselves, where it's like looking it I think often like just the clinical approach to mental health can disconnect us from ourselves, because it's like it often decontextualizes things. It like it tries to make things scientific even when it's not appropriate and even when there isn't actual scientific grounding. um, and then like what facilitates that connection to ourselves, I think some obvious things like meditation and journaling can do that. Different modalities of self-awareness practices, connecting with people that are really like-minded, right? That can definitely facilitate the connection to ourselves. Doing things that where there's some degree of like passion and purpose. Um, Being in nature is a big one for me. Like different things that just kind of facilitate that. And so I think like as we're coming out of this, getting clear on what are the things that sort of broke that connection to ourselves. I mean, abuse and mistreatment's another big one. But then also getting clear on what can help facilitate that. What can facilitate that reconnection.
Mm-hmm. Totally, totally. I guess does anything come to mind in terms of like, I guess solutions or like just things, ways that the schooling system could develop? Or does the whole thing just need to be, I don't know, transformed from the bottom up?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of good ideas out there for better education methods. I mean, there certainly were plenty out there that would have been a lot better for me. I think, yeah, ones that are kind of like there's always been an understanding that the school system is authoritarian, and it hurts kids' connection to themselves and undermines well-being. But then there's always been this dominant narrative that, oh no, this is actually exactly what they need. And I think like that's most of what, proponents of the school system buy into, is they think this method is necessary for development, and they have this like, um, this kind of pseudo-scientific story about, like why there's scientific reason for that I don't really buy into. But there's always been better ideas out there, and I think like more kind of self-directed education methods, certain like kind of like genuinely progressive education methods can be good. As far as, I don't really have ideas for like broad policy ideas or things like that. I just think, whatever we can do that can help kind of facilitate, that can help to open things up so that some of these better ideas can emerge
Mm-hmm.
would be a good thing. But that's part of why like I'm just generally more focused on what can we do coming out of this, right? Like what can all the millions of us that went through this kind of thing, uh, and we're like put on medication against our will and things like that. What can we do to then heal and develop ourselves? Uh,
Hmm.
and I guess even like educate ourselves, long term.
Yeah. Yeah, what's coming to mind for me is just it's almost like humanity's collective ego is just like just having to sort of has to wither away, and it's withering away slowly, and the schooling system is just like a manifestation of that. It's like it's almost like the traditional like empath narcissists relationship where like a lot of like empaths as kids who get like abused end up becoming narcissists later on in life. And it's almost like just like the controller controlled dynamic that just keeps playing out over and over again. And it's seen in like, modern institutional religions in a way. And then, as you were saying something along the lines of, like losing connection to yourself, I was also thinking of like modern like scientific practices that also have sort of like a controlling element to them. In the way that like, like modern Western science really tries to control for subjectivity,
Yeah.
in a way where it's like, our own subjective experience is flawed or like it's unreliable. And so you have to kind of adhere to what these PhDs have said about how human beings work and how nature works and everything. And so in that way, we're kind of like denying our it like kind of like denies our own intuition about like ourselves and whatnot. So I guess yeah, which one do you feel more called to speak on? So like that collective ego, or like kind of like more specifically like kind of like science, which is like kind of the public schooling's system's way of sort of justifying, just going off tradition and going off, what's written in the books rather than what's going on inside of you.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that. That's something I've thought a lot about because I think that like that is basically what's shaping a lot of us is like it's not even I wouldn't even call it science. It's like an overreach of technocratic control. And they're sort of like using the name of science to justify these things, but if you look at it, there's actually not sci proper like scientific grounding behind any of it. And so because like I think that like science has there are domains where let's say technocratic control, which could be you could say is like the application of science toward management and governance, is very appropriate. Is very appropriate. Certain fields where there's like very clear scientific grounding, there's really well established like technical standards that can be verified and enforced. So in other words, like competence can be clearly established and well enforced. That there are fields that are great, perfectly suited for that, right? Engineering, accounting, I think a lot of medicine, as far as I understand. Um, but but we've taken that and we've applied it to areas where it's very inappropriate, and it ends up being incredibly destructive. And the two main areas where that, for me, that comes to mind are the school system and the mental health system. And I think that like part of what you're getting at is by doing that, we end up undermining our own like potential and well-being and sort of abilities as humans that need to be cultivated. And that's where like an approach that's more intuitive and maybe more creative and more like, I mean, I guess you could use the word spiritual. That word has a lot of baggage, but something like that, right? Like those those kinds of things are more appropriate for that area where those things can be cultivated. But when we impose this like this kind of scientism and this technocratic control on these domains, we end up like harming people and kind of undermining their well-being and undermining who they are. So that's, I mean, that's a huge topic. And for me, like waking up to that was a big like part of my path.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we're touching on a topic of interest of mine personally, but to
Yeah.
me, like in the US at least, it really seems like there's like two teams. There's like the science crowd, like the strict science adherents, often progressive voters, like liberal culture, and then there's like the Christian crowd, which tends to be more like conservative and stuff. And both of these, yeah, it's almost like people either fall into like one or two camps, and both camps kind of have their way of, yeah, like there's just like controlling and ego in both camps. And it seems like in the schooling system, it seems like the science crowd sort of like runs that a bit more. Um, and yeah, it's they're almost like there's so many similarities between the two. And I think both of those like parties just kind of like can like need to zoom out a little bit and kind of
Yeah.
like reevaluate their like core presumptions and their core philosophies, the core things that they've been operating from. Um, yeah, and it seems like more and more people are waking up, in kind of like a spiritual way or becoming less interested in these like, like people are becoming less religious. Or I don't know, yeah. It's hard to explain what's really going on right now. Like in a way, like people are becoming less religious, or like, but then at the same time, like there's also like this like new wave of just like people kind of getting into religion, and like this new atheism thing is like also sort of becoming unpopular.
Mm.
Um, I know I just kind of said like a jumble of things, but do you kind of agree with that? Like these like two sides? Does that like resonate?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, because I think in many ways like, at least when it comes to what we're talking about, there's a certain way of operating that's pretty dominant, which I think is what we're talking about. It's like that science, but it's not really science, right? It's like, um, like when we talk about those two systems, it's pretty, I think that's a pretty dominant way of doing things. But then, yeah, there are these other forces, like there's, like the religious right in the United States, um, and yeah, I kind of think like kind of cultivating our own path and our creating our own like sort of bespoke worldview, our own kind of custom worldview is really empowering, right? And not like getting locked into any one, you know, any one thing, even if it's like some niche thing online that maybe speaks to us on some level, like really finding, you know, what we think is true. And that's been a big part of my own path, right? Like discovering all these different aspects, and now like I have a cool bookshelf right with all these things, but I also have like a good sense of a kind of evolving worldview and perspective on these different things. Like for me, it started with, or didn't start with, but there was this book. I think we might have talked about it before. It's that book, Making of a Counterculture, which was
Hmm.
really got me starting to think about basically exactly what you're talking about, where it's like how this kind of scientism and technocratic control undermines these human like capacities and potentialities that we have. Um and so like that was a big thing, right? And then encountering like Taoism and Stoicism and like all these different things that spoke to these different aspects, right? Or like the like anti-authoritarian approaches to mental health and education. It all kind of started to fit together for me. So I think like kind of like declaring independence from uh any different like school of thought or any different movement, it can be really powerful.
Hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like what you would be a fan of is just like letting people just be students, like being students of philosophy and being students of spirituality. Just, I mean, like being a student of life pretty much.
Yeah.
And being like your own student instead of like a student of just this one sort of approach that certain people have deemed as like the correct one. Even though there's so many other like forms of knowledge and culture out there. Um,
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And along with that, the way that people are showing up, right? The way that they're operating in the world is very different depending if it's like what you're talking about or what we've been, I guess, advocating for versus the way a lot of people, probably maybe most people, but like a lot of people do things where it's like kind of rigidly promoting a certain thing that you've decided is right. And maybe there's a tribal aspect and whatnot, so it's like if you're more of a student of life and you're a truth seeker, you're trying to understand the truth of yourself and the people around you and the world, the way that you're going to show up is very different, and the way that you're going to explore things is very different, right? You're going to like any kind of emotional reactivity you have around these different topics or things like that, you're going to try to integrate that as you go along so that you can get closer to the truth. Whereas I think that, the people that are kind of upholding our world, upholding the different, or I should say like upholding uh, things that aren't working in our world, that are upholding, that are kind of rigidly sticking to either this side or this side, they're not doing that, right? Like they have a lot of, I guess, like you were talking about ego before, right? Like they have a lot of like unresolved, I would argue unresolved emotional pain that's underneath that they're defending. So
Hmm.
yeah, so it's like there's a whole kind of it's like a comprehensive thing, right? It's like your the self-awareness aspect to it is also a huge part of that kind of like being a student of life.
Yeah, I think similar to this topic of like, a hive mind and, you know, being like taught a certain way, I think AI is like having a huge impact on a lot of that, where now it's like, you know, pretty much the robot is becoming more and more is having more and more authority. And it's sort of like more and more just dictating what we're thinking,
Mm.
pretty much. Like these days you search something up on Google and it just tells you pretty much like what to think
Mm.
about it. Um, and so obviously, yeah, I guess I do just always want to weave AI into these conversations since it's like super important. And so I
Yeah.
guess, yeah, what do you think? There's so many ways you can take this, but just like, what do you think the implications of AI are going to be on this sort of thing? And like, will it benefit or will it just sort of consolidate the power more?
Mm. I mean, that's a super hard question, right? Like, because I think it's potentially doing all of those things at
Yeah.
once. So, like, directionally, which one is it doing more of? I mean, I think it has a powerful decentralization aspect, which is could be a very good thing in some ways. But then it also, like you're saying, it you just ask it a question, it feeds you like kind of what to think. But then at the same time, but then if you respond to it a couple times, you can basically get it to just tell you anything you want to. So it's like, uh, so then it's also kind of like the opposite of having a centralized thing. Like I think that, the people out there that are really like, everyone needs to think this way about this, we need to have that. A lot of those people I think are really worried about AI because they feel like it's gonna undermine what they think. I would say like, yeah, I mean, on an individual level, I think AI can be powerful and also have its dangers. One of the ways it can be powerful is because, like, like in terms of everything we've been talking about, right? You have like young people that are coming out of these environments where they've been like totally invalidated, totally misunderstood. You can, so I'm sorry, so I should step back for a minute. Like a lot of people complain that what AI does is it just kind of like will like validate and reinforce anything, right? It will never challenge you or question you. It's very sycophantic. And um so for those of us that are coming out of environments where we've been totally misunderstood, totally invalidated, potentially like having more of that reinforcement of whatever we're thinking could be helpful. It's certainly at times it could be helpful, but like being wise about when to take that in is important because maybe we have certain views or beliefs that are like problematic and are part of our like larger wounded conditioning. So then could they just be reinforcing that? So, like for me, having people that just provided a lot of validation and really like reinforce that was really helpful. I don't know if I'd had a machine doing that, if that would have been a good thing, especially early on. So, what role does AI play here? I don't know. It's really hard to say, you know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a fair answer, and there's a lot of like insight in what you said. And yeah, I guess like what I'm thinking of is just there's no reason not to believe that like there's there's gonna be more technocratic control. Like, AI and all this new technology is just gonna give these institutions much more control over people's lives. But on an individual level, like it also gives us a lot more freedom to sort of like choose our own path. This is kind of like what the
Yeah.
internet and social media has granted people like has it's granted people access to so many things. I mean, you and I like gained so much of our insight and knowledge from the internet and like through social media, like it helps us connect to different people. So in a way, it's again, it's one of those things where it's like there's like two things going on. There's like a positive aspect and a negative aspect. And so I'm just like I'm really fascinated to see how that's going to impact this new generation. Like, are we going to have people, who just in a much more powerful way, like break out of these institutions, create something new, create something powerful, and just like really be more independent thinkers than, either of us are. Like this new generation, it's just like a blank slate. It's really interesting. And then on the other hand, is this just going to be yeah, is the school system just going to be even more soulless? And are these because like the mental health crisis isn't really turning around very fast. So yeah, those are like two things that I'm thinking of. Did anything come to mind when I said that?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like in the whole technology world of basically Silicon Valley, right? There's been this current that you can read about, right? Like there's been a lot of books written on it. That's gone back, basically to the 60s, if not even a little bit before, of like to the very beginning of Silicon Valley, this current of almost like a countercultural thing of like we can like technology can be used to empower individuals to kind of create their own civilization, right? Create their own communities, create their own lives, be independent of like technocratic control and experts and big business and bureaucracy. That's the big one, bureaucracy, right? And so that's been a huge like current that's kind of driven so much of Silicon Valley. And it goes back to like the Whole Earth Catalog. I don't know if you've heard about that. That was like considered like the internet before the internet. It was basically like this giant book. It came out in the late 60s that was just filled with like all the different things in the world that you could do, right? Like all the different tools out there. And there's all these different sections, right? On like, shelter and community and all these different things. So like people were using that to build their own houses, out in the country. And there was like this whole phenomenon of people like they'd start these like marijuana farms, right? Like in far northern California, and they'd create their own geodesic domes and like would do homesteading. But then there was also the really early computer stuff there, and that like a lot of the Silicon Valley world came out of that because people were like doing their own kind of DIY stuff. And so there's a you could see how AI could potentially be a part of that broader thing, right? Where it's like, okay, we had personal computers that were like empowering us vis-a-vis the government. And by the way, right here, I'm sharing like a totally idealized version of this. There's huge problems with this and limitations and a lot of things people could criticize, but I'm just talking about the idealized like version just so we know what it is. And you could see how AI could potentially be a part of that, or people could argue that it could be part of that, right? Like, oh, now you have this thing that is simultaneously like a decent engineer and a decent, financial analyst, and like it's provides all these things for you, right? Whereas before, like the internet was a powerful version of that, but what it was it allowed you to then learn how to become your own engineer. But how long does that take, right? You couldn't just bypass that whole process, and now you have this thing that can do a lot of these things for you.
Hmm.
So I think in that way it could be very, very powerful and could have a like potentially this powerful like decentralization effect. But what that means in terms of like people's livelihood and income inequality and all these different issues, it's there's some big questions there for sure.
Yeah, totally. And all we can do is sort of like make our best predictions. I think one thing that came to mind for me, which I thought was actually like a really interesting insight, was like I could imagine like just kids are going to be much different inherently, like, or people are just going to from their birth and their earliest foundations are going to have very different upbringings from, I guess, equalize. Like, for example, some parents are going to do very conscious parenting practices, be very strict on the screen time. They're very well educated on like how to raise a kid and attachment styles and all that. And then there's other parents who will be able to just, I don't know, give their kid to the robot and like let the robot take care of it and just put it in front of an iPad. And so like yeah, that's like I guess a prediction I'm making too is like kids without really having much like say over it are just going to be kind of going to land in like very different situations. And I think I can imagine there just being like a much greater divide just between people starting off from those like earliest ages. And that might create like a big difference in, yeah, like two people's like emotional flexibility and like sort of like their wisdom and their philosophy and all of these things. Like, yeah, just like that's like a really interesting thought for me. It's like humans are just gonna be very different from each other. Does that
Yeah.
resonate? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it almost seems like just a expansion of like what we already see, right? Some kids, grow up drinking lead contaminated water, and other kids grow up, in relatively like privileged situations. I mean, there's just a lot of variation, and yeah, the way technology could feed into that could be a big thing too. And something I would add, I was actually talking about this in a video recently, which was people like even in terms of what we experience in school, there's actually a significant amount of variation. Um, so I think the school system is actually like pretty uniform in the ways that matter. Some people will disagree with that, but I would stand by that in the ways that matter, in terms of like you could say the hidden curriculum, which is basically like the structure of school and how it shapes you, that's pretty uniform. However, if you look at elite education in this country, it's a different thing to a large extent. Like my understanding is that if you look at like elite private schools, particularly the ones on the East Coast, that kind of thing, there is more of an emphasis on like kids learning to have more agency and question authority and all of that, because those skills are useful when you're being like fast tracked to basically like control the levers of power in our world, right? And that's just the reality of it, right? Like kids come from certain elite backgrounds, they're basically like shaped, in order to kind of to sort of do that well. And so I would say that like there's a there can be some significant disparities there where it's like this small number of people experience something different, but then the rest of us, yeah, experience schooling as we know it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. And yeah, no, I guess I want to say too, like, I grew up like, I guess privileged. Like that's like a way that like people describe it. And I think that really did a lot for me. Like I think it actually does give me a lot more. Yeah, I think it gave me a lot more flexibility in terms of just like, yeah, free thinking and just growing up with like healthy cooking and, you
Mhm.
know, having a lot of like outside time and everything like that.
Yeah.
Like these days, that's like a privilege. That's really like that is sort of, yeah, like a sign of like a privileged background. Like, you know, my parents were able to support me financially in these ways, which helped me in that way. And then yeah, I think I guess I'm like generalizing here, but I think in those, I guess, poorer communities or demographics, you know, kids end up being a bit more like TikTok addicted and just like, yeah, like you know, like worse diets, everything like that. So unfortunately to say, yeah, I think a lot of this does come down to like money and like economics and like whoever has the money will have the power. Um, so I guess it's up to so I think that's actually where our channels like actually have like a lot of power is like, you know, like we are like we have the capacity and like the circumstances to be able to like think freely and then like question sort of like the institutions.
Yeah.
Does that like kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, yeah, it really does. It really does because there's a big theme in what we're talking about, which is like the use of these different things to kind of manage kids. And when you come from like more of an if there's more of an underprivileged situation, right, where there's some more like economic precarity, then these things can become like just from the parent standpoint like really necessary ways to just manage the kid because you have to survive. It's like if a kid is like screaming to you that they want McDonald's, like you don't have the time to be patient. Maybe you don't have the time to be patient and whatnot. You have to manage that situation, so you're just going to give them McDonald's. Then they become addicted to whatever, right? So or some, I mean, just as an example, or it's like medication is a big part of that too. Like my understanding is that there's like poorer kids tend to be more heavily medicated
Hmm.
because like that situation just has to be managed, right? Like parents don't necessarily have the time or patience or whatever to deal with this. There's a lot of stress there. Um, and so I think in some ways these things are like really unexcusable because it's like, you know, parents in many cases they could have more awareness and they could be doing these things, but they choose to be in denial because it's just painful to become more self-aware. And in that case, I think it's much less justifiable. But I think that, you just have really tricky situations where there's so much stress. The parents have to find a way to manage it. And then, these psychiatrists come in and, you know, and do this. I think that the issue is really like a lack of informed consent. And of course, a child probably can never really provide informed consent, at least for a lot of these things.
Hmm.
But it's like if we're saying like, okay, this is a way that we have to manage the situation, and we're going to think about long term here, like what can we do? Okay, that's one thing, but it's a whole other thing to say you have a chemical imbalance, you have, broken like brain circuitry or whatever, when there's no basis for it, when there's like no basis to say that. And then, this your child needs medication indefinitely. So yeah, I went off on a little bit of a rant there, but these are just different things to be considered.
Oh, it's all great. I love it. And yeah, what came to mind for me is like, yeah, eventually people need to make a decision on like, okay, am I going to keep playing along with these rules? Am I going to stay in denial? Am I going to, you know, stay in these rigid habit patterns and like never sort of break out of them? Or am I going to question it? Which, you know, takes a lot of self-development. You know, it's pretty uncomfortable. Am I going to question it and take my power back? And there's like pros and cons to both sides. But eventually, people need to make a decision, an energetic level or just like a collective level where it's like, I think a lot of us are at a crossroads Like even, you know, like when you look at people who are like talking about like fields of science, for example, like you can tell that like a lot of these fields of science are, you know, hitting sort of like a roadblock with like a lot of their fixed methodologies and like how it's kind of not leading to any new results. And like I think humanity is sort of at a crossroads with all of this. But I think it's, you know, again, like kind of bring it back to our conversation. It starts with the kids. You know, it starts with like that development and that parenting. Um, yeah, and I didn't know that poorer kids were more medicated, which is actually like really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of like ways that you can see, the different aspects of these things. Like there's the socioeconomic aspect, there's the racial aspect, like black kids face different conditions in the school system. Like obviously, right, the school to prison pipeline is a bigger thing there. They get more harsh psychiatric diagnoses, things like that. Um, yeah, and so like that's just a big part of it. Um, yeah, I mean, I came from like more of a middle class, kind of like solid sort of middle class background where like when I was sent to the troubled teen industry, it would like people have this idea that it's just these ultra rich parents. But in my case, it wasn't that. What they did was they pressured my parents into taking out loans. So like these enormous loans for these incredibly abusive programs. And it's just awful. Like when you think about the exploitation of parents too, like that's a big part of this. Parents can be heavily exploited by these industries, and it can be very predatory.
Hmm. Interesting. Wait, so you're saying like parents are sort of like recommended by these industries to follow certain practices that, yeah, I guess aren't for the benefit of the kids. Kind of like, is it similar to like the pressure to like send kids off to like these really expensive undergraduate programs or yeah, yeah, I guess tell me a little more.
I don't know that it's related to college, but it's more like, yeah, like so when it comes to youth mental health treatment, yeah, what'll happen is, these programs essentially arguably like prey on vulnerable parents, right? And who are, struggling like with their family situation, and these programs say, oh yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with you and your family, like your kid just needs discipline or whatever, and then they'll kind of coerce these kids or whatnot. But I think there's elements of that in all of the youth mental health system, right, of like just preying on parental vulnerability, not telling parents the truth about what's going on, and just kind of like providing some degree of instant gratification for the parents.
Hmm.
Uh, and yeah, I think like when they pressure parents to take out loans to spend money that they don't have, that's where you can see it being like very predatory.
Hmm. Totally. I want to ask you now about like some of the other things that you do or like yeah, some of the other like work you're doing. I know you work with like Inner Compass Initiative. And I kind of want to, I don't know, let you talk about that a little bit. Um, yeah.
Well, I do. So I spoke at the Intercompass Initiative conference, which is very exciting. You can see if you go on my website, you can see like a list of different like podcasts and things like that I've done, and you can see the recording of that conference. So that was exciting to kind of speak about some of these things. And yeah, like generally I just here very much feel called to help those of us that went through these things where we were kind of in an authoritarian environment when we were younger, and then we were like medicated and coerced. And so yeah, I'm just like interested in kind of sharing everything that I've learned. I have a YouTube channel which I use to kind of help provide like education around some of these things. Also on Twitter I share like more shorter ideas. So yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else that you like feel called to speak on that like you didn't get a chance to share?
um we covered a lot. Nothing like really pressing comes to mind.
Right on. Yeah. Well, hey, yeah, I mean, honestly, so many things we could speak about, but it's been a pretty long conversation, so I feel complete with it. And yeah, dude, I really appreciate you coming on. I feel like I learned a lot. You just like have so much like wisdom and background and all these things. So yeah, there's a lot I can pick your brain about. So yeah, I really appreciate having you on. And then all like resources and links of yours, I'll put in the bio below.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's all. Anything else or no?
No, thank you so much, Nathan. I just really grateful for the opportunity. Really enjoyed talking. So thank you. And thank you to all your listeners.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.